Hey, and welcome back. Today I have a bit of a different project I was asked to do. One of my students' mothers asked me if I could help her make some sort of display for a drumhead she received as a gift from a friend of hers. Turns out her friend is one of the most recorded drummers of all time and happened to play on an album for another very, very famous drummer. He sent her a 12-inch drumhead used on the session, signed by both of them. I was extremely blown away seeing both their signatures in person, and I'd love to share who they are, but it's not my place and I'd like to respect their privacy. I knew I wanted to mount the head into the frame the same way it'd be mounted on a drum. So I went into my stock of parts and grabbed an old head to use as a placeholder while I built the frame, a triple flanged hoop to secure it in place, and some tension rods to secure all of that together. In some projects in the past, I've used these square nuts that have the same thread pitch as standard tension rods. Most recently I used this on some single tension drums I've made, like the pancake snare on my channel. So with all these parts picked out, I went over to my dad's shop to get started on this project. I started by taking this 2x4 foot, 1/2 inch thick plywood panel and trimmed it down to a 12-inch square so that I could make an insert for the head to rest on while it was mounted. Once I trimmed it down, I took an extra old head and trimmed out the collar to trace the interior onto that piece of wood. I then went ahead and cut that down with the jigsaw, and after that I went and cleaned it up on the drum sander and got it closely lined up to where I needed. Once I had a nice fit, I took a trim router and added a 45-degree chamfer to the edge of the circumference to get it closer to the actual contour of a drum head, which has a concave profile to it to set nicely to the bearing edge of a drum. After I had the circular disc finished, I took the rest of my plywood panel and laid out my head and hoop to get a feel for how large I wanted the frame to be. I ended up going with a back panel about 15 inches square, but you could do this whatever size you wanted if you prefer to add photos or other memorabilia in the frame with it. I then went back and cut this panel out again on the table saw. After I had both my back panel and the circular disc ready to go, I laid out all my parts once again to get everything centered. I was able to do this by drawing a center line directly across the panel and then using the holes in the hoops to help align it. After I was confident with the layout, I glued the circular disc onto the panel and added some brad nails to hold it in place while the glue dried. Using the hoop as a guide, I drilled 6 holes through the back of the panel to allow me to thread the tension rods through. I then came around to the back side and added some larger countersink holes about 1/8 of an inch down or so to allow the square nuts to inset into the back panel nice and flush. Once again, I did another dry fit to make sure everything was how I anticipated, and you can really see how this will all come together at this point. I disassembled everything to prep for paint, and I gave the panel a quick sanding to remove any rough burrs from the drilling and clean up the surface. For this back panel, I used this royal blue spray paint, and this color was chosen because the signatures on the actual drumhead were signed with a blue Sharpie, and this was the closest match I could find to that color. Over the next few hours, I applied a number of coats, trying to get a nice even finish. I don't have great patience when it comes to spray painting, but I think this one turned out fine. And after the 3rd coat, I let this dry and cure for a couple days until I could come back and work on the frame.
3 days later.
For the frame, I used an 8-foot 1x4 piece of aspen. I started by cutting that board down into 4 oversized pieces to make it a little bit more manageable to work with on the table saw. I consider myself a fairly competent woodworker, but my dad is excellent with building frames, so I was glad to have his help on this stage of the project. In this process, I consider it essential to have some scrap material to do test cuts before working with your actual pieces. These cuts are extremely specific, and it's good to be able to test everything out and make fine-tune adjustments before working with your actual pieces. We made a cut vertically and horizontally to notch out a 1-inch by 1/2 inch rabbet on the back, and then we could move on to cutting a dado for the glass to sit in. Luckily, we were able to do this in one pass, and then we had all 4 sides prepped and ready to be cut to final dimensions. I won't show you all the time we spent measuring and dry fitting on camera, but I think this is a great time to emphasize measure twice, cut once, especially with these 45-degree mitered corners. We did all these cuts on the miter saw, and then once all the boards were at their final dimension, we could do a dry fit again using these great corner clamps from Rockler. I honestly love these things and can't recommend them enough to anybody needing smaller, sturdy, reliable clamps for glue-ups or dry fits like this. Once I was sure everything was going to fit, we then got a measurement for the glass, and I went over to my local Lowe's to buy a glass pane and get it cut down to size. I moved on to finishing and started with this gel stain that was supposed to be a close match to the trim of the client's house, but I eventually needed to shift to something different after the aspen didn't bring out the same color as I was hoping. Once I had the finish where I liked, I moved on to the glue up for the frame. I used the glass to help keep the alignment of everything in place while I assembled, and I just made sure to be careful with the squeeze out of the glue as I clamped each piece in place. I used clamps to get everything nice and tight, and then came back with a brad nailer to tack things together, making sure to avoid shooting any brads into a spot where it might hit glass. Once all of this was together, I could move on to creating the mounting system for hanging this on the wall. Because of the weight of this frame, I didn't feel comfortable using standard picture frame hardware, so for this project, I used a French cleat. If you're not aware of what this is, it's basically two pieces split at a 45-degree angle that nest into one another and lock in place. This is a pretty great solution for mounting heavier things on a wall, and you'll see it a lot in shops or garages. After I cut this down, I mounted the top onto the back of the frame, leaving the long side of the angled cut towards the outside. For the other side of the cleat that would be mounted on the wall, I cut down the length a little bit to allow some forgiveness and wiggle room after mounting. I had to drill 2 holes in the top cleat to allow access to the tension rods, and after I had everything mounted, I came back and trimmed the length of those tension rods a bit shorter so they wouldn't protrude past the frame. Once I did this, the entire project was pretty much complete. So all in all, I'm extremely happy with how this project turned out, and the family I made it for was over the moon with the results. I love the way the drum head is secured into the frame with actual drum mounting hardware and covers up the not so attractive parts of the drum head. I love the color scheme that they chose, and you'll just have to take my word for it, but it looks perfect with those signatures on the actual head. All in all, I spent $22 on the 2x4 foot panel, $15 on the aspen board, $7 on the stain, $4 on the spray paint, and $8 on glass. I already had the tension rods, drum hoop, and square nuts on hand, so that brings the grand total to $56 all in for this project. I hope you found this video helpful, and maybe it'll give you some ideas for a similar project. If you've done something like this, I'd love to hear about it, so leave a comment down below. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to my channel to stay up to date on future video releases. Until next time, thanks.